research need and the thinking that drove this work really came down to some shared and mutual frustrations that we had as a research team. That we were sitting in front of media footage and looking at emergency messaging over periods of time and wondering why we didn't see people behaving in the way that that they'd been asked to behave. And I think the most obvious expression of that is often seeing people drive in high stress situations through flooded water and getting into trouble. And we thought together that there might be some capacity for us to apply a number of different theoretical models to seeing if we could improve the relationship in emergency messaging between the message and the behaviour that you're actually trying to elicit. So that's really what started the whole exercise for us. We have a mixed group, and we'd not worked together before, but I think in many ways the collective wisdoms across a number of disciplines have been really helpful. So my background is in human behaviour and psychology. My colleagues on the team have got great experience in marketing and advertising, risk communications, organisational psychology. And when we put all of those together, we found that we had some really good theoretical frameworks which existed for us to apply to this new messaging framework. And we know from advertising and marketing is very successful in getting human beings to do things which they may not have considered before. And so that, together with our understanding of how humans behave under pressure, how we process information, and how we translate that into a desire to act in a particular way, all came together in the work that we were able to do. I think most of us have heard about and understood the fight or flight science, which suggests that when you put human beings and many mammals under pressure, that a lot of their behavioural actions are driven by changes in their hormonal structure. It's that primary. And that forces us to make decisions about whether or not we're going to stay and fight or run away, basically. And whether you do that physically or you do it from a psychological standpoint, the drivers are very much the same. We also know that people don't process complicated information necessarily in the same way that they do when their mindset and their environment is different. And it's a very fine line between being able to apply the added value of an adrenaline surge that comes with that fight or flight, which sometimes can actually result in human beings doing the most remarkable things in a good way. But it's a very fine line between that and not behaving, not being able to problem solve, not being able to conduct an action in the way which would maximise your safety. And at the end of the day, these emergency services messaging and the information that we're trying to provide communities is about one thing and one thing only, and that is the protection of life and property. These messages should have the capacity to save lives wherever possible. When you look back historically over how emergency messaging and communication has changed over time, you'll find a period in which a lot of the community-facing messaging included a lot of operational language, a lot of acronyms, a lot of scientific terms, and phrases which are understandable only if you're in those professions, and to most of us in the community don't make any sense at all. And then, so that was driven by a recognition that it was as important to communicate to the community as it was to communicate effectively between agencies or within operational groups. But it quickly became apparent that those messages were not necessarily understood effectively by people, and as a consequence they didn't trigger the right sort of actions. They left people sort of understanding that there was something big and important and probably risky going on, but and they told people how many resources were deployed to it and what the location was and how bad it was, but they didn't actually tell me as a consumer anything about how I could protect myself. I sometimes think that as the dialogue has shifted over time, from one where our primary narrative was that emergency services agencies were there to rescue and protect us, to now a dialogue which is more commonly about mutual obligation and the help us to help you. Please get prepared before storm seasons. Please understand your exit routes if you're under pressure from a hazard event. Please understand where your local evacuation centres are likely to be, and help us to help you when things go bad is a much more frequent dialogue. And whether it's related or just coincidental, as we've seen that progression in the narrative around emergency services, we've also seen a simplification of, and as a consequence, strangely, increased effectiveness of the communications that face outward and help us to protect people who are not operationally knowledgeable. It's really important, I think, for us to understand that in behavioural terms, there's not necessarily a linear relationship between the sharing of information and 100% action of the behaviour that's been requested. So there's a lot of things that happen between those two points. Many people will talk about messages being able to trigger a particular, we call it a behavioural intention. So if you were in this circumstance, how would you behave if you heard this message? But in reality, when you're asking people to make decisions under pressure, we mustn't assume that they've got all of the things that they care about all in the right place at the right time and can actually do what we're asking them to do. So some of the behaviour which is very frustrating, no doubt, to watch in the media or if you're in an operational role, relates to people being unable to enact the advice that it's been given. And then there's a group of the population who perhaps have a higher risk threshold than some of the rest of us, and will feel confident that they can somehow stand up against a threat. I have to say, I've heard people speak over many years now about their experience, for instance, in staying and defending a property from fire. And some of my own family have faced the complete loss of all of their possessions and their home in wildfires. And I've heard people say that I did stay and defend my property once, and I will never do it again. The ferocity of that experience is very significant. If you've not lived through those things and don't understand, or for instance don't understand the power of hydrology and what happens to roadways underneath flooded causeways and the capacity of water to move huge pieces of equipment or rocks or whatever, then it's very hard for you to actually assess the personal risk. So I think it's not a straightforward relationship, and we should never expect 100% compliance for all of those reasons. When people are under stress, they draw on a number of different resources to help them determine whether or not this risk is a personal and immediate one, or whether or not it's one that is immediate but not significant, or one that might happen sometime in the future. And as a consequence, do I really need to do anything about that now? Well, maybe not. We've invested a lot as emergency services agencies over the years in trying to get people to pre-prepare for events that they've never experienced before. And so a couple of things play into how people assess the risk. The immediacy of the perceived threat, the level of threat ascribed to that particular hazard. We know, interestingly, in the literature that people seem to be more fearful or risk alert to fire rather than to water and flood. You only have to watch the footage from the Fukushima tsunami to realise that the power of water is equal to the power of fire. But unless you've experienced that, I think people struggle with determining just how much of an impact this is going to have. So experience, time, and the other factors that affect risk perception relate to past experiences, I think. And people naturally develop different senses of perception about their capacity to respond, and as a consequence, their risk. I think I mentioned earlier, and some people who believe that they probably could defend their property from fire, from wildfire, have the experience and survive, and that experience determines that they will never do it again. Where somebody else who's had a very similar experience will have quite a different response and will say, well, I've done it once, I can do it again. And all of that relates to factors like personality, perhaps age, possibly there's an influence of gender, but personality types, I think in particular. The expectation that one message framed in one way from one source using one media channel will be equally effective for 100% of the population, or will be able to trigger 100% response is flawed. We have to understand that there are segments in the population who will approach information from authoritative sources differently as a function of age, a function of socioeconomic status, as a function of previous experience with authority agencies. We have to appreciate that, and we live in very diverse communities these days, and we use a variety of different channels to receive our information. So a message that we might write, or my colleagues in emergency services might write for a tweet, is clearly not going to be the same as the sort of message that you'd see on Facebook from the same agency relating to the same event. And it won't be the same as the sort of information that they might receive from another related media channel, such as the ABC emergency news. So what we have to, though, try and facilitate is consistency across those sources, acknowledging that at any particular point in time, a message about the same event, which needs to convey the same urgency, is going out on multiple platforms. But you want everybody who receives that message to get the same message, regardless of the channel, is really important. But there's so many factors that are associated with people's desire or ability to respond that we will never get 100% compliance with the message, I don't believe. But we certainly can continue to build the efficacy as the evidence develops around how we process this information. And in fact, for that matter, as our media and communication channels change, emergency services agencies are increasingly looking to the value of social media channels to communicate messages, because we carry around our information sources in our hands most of the time these days. There's still a proportion of the population who will always want, while they're alive, to rely on ABC radio and the ABC News. As we know in Australia, are the traditional channels you turn to if you want reputable, trustworthy advice about what's going on in your area. But as that threats change and as our communication channels change, we'll have to be ongoingly alert about whether or not the messages we construct still fit effectively the channels we have. So whether or not emergency communications actually work is a not simple thing to measure. Has your communication worked if everybody heard it, even if not everybody actually behaved the way you wanted them to? Has it worked if the vast majority of people did what you want them to do? And the metrics for determining what equals effective communication, I think, are still being pursued. And all I would say is that I doubt very much that we'll ever have, outside a police state, any capacity for 100% compliance based on an emergency warning message. I think this is a long-term science. This is by nature a longitudinal science, and I say that because many people working in this field will attest to the fact that climate change and other triggers in the way we structure our communities mean going forward that, and we've started to experience this already, I would have to say, that the natural hazard events that we are facing are becoming more extreme. And rather than having the traditional flood or the traditional fire time of the year, we see events occurring outside what we would normally expect their traditional time frame is. And we see that similarly with cyclones and with other forms of natural hazard events. So as the severity and the complexity of these events changes over time, and as our communication tools change over time, we have to be constantly vigilant and have mechanisms for measuring the ongoing effectiveness of the messages that we send out to community that are specifically designed to trigger a behaviour to protect life and or property. And I think the task is going to become more complex rather than less.